Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. Today we are doing something a little bit different. So this is the final episode of a mini-series entitled What Makes an Astrologer, which came about as a result of the comments that Rob Hand made on a recent Astrology Podcast episode about significations in the birth chart of a professional astrologer. The link to this episode is in the show notes. Therein, Rob Hand makes a bit of an offhand comment saying, "The 11th sign from the Lot of Fortune is a place of acquisition. People," and here he's referring to Project Hindsight, "started looking at their charts, and an awful lot of people had one of the following things true. The Lot of Fortune was in a sign ruled by Mercury, or Mercury was in the sign of the Lot of Fortune, or those same two conditions applied to the place of acquisition, which is the 11th sign from the Lot of Fortune. And to this day, if I don't find that in a person's chart, I wonder about their credentials as an astrologer. This is for making money by astrology, by the way. It's not for studying it. All you need to study it is a good, solid Mercury." End quote. In the wake of this episode, there was some commentary about it on social media. Being curious about what Hand said, I put out a tweet thread looking at these conditions in 5 professional astrologers' charts. In one way or another, all 5 of those people met Hand's criteria. I've put a link to that tweet thread in the show notes for your reference. In response to that, Michelle, who is Astrospection on Twitter, shared a database of famous astrologers from astroseek.com with me and encouraged me to do more research into this subject. I was reticent, but Mo, who is Astral Tour on Twitter, told me that she'd help me carry out a research project looking at Hand's criteria in famous and/or professional astrologers' charts. In this series, I spoke with 5 astrologers and thinkers: Cameron Allen, Daniel Norman, Amy Green, Dorje Kirsten, and Alié Alomi, about their thoughts on Rob Hand's comments and other significations they identify in the birth chart that may point to remuneration from astrology. This is the culmination of that series, a conversation between Mo and I where we discuss our research and the conclusions that we've drawn from it. In addition, I plan to release an episode on my website in the next couple of weeks where I summarize our findings and the thoughts of my guests in this series. Please be sure to subscribe to my website for updates, which is linked in the show notes below. Before we move on to the conversation, I wanted to share a quote from Christopher Warnock from my recent correspondence with him. After saying that he doesn't meet Hand's criteria and has supported himself and his family financially via astrology for many years, he said, "It's not that Rob Hand is wrong about this particular signature. It's just that there is never a 100% correspondence between signatures and what is predicted. Astrological prediction is not, in my opinion, a matter of analysis, breaking everything down to specific, never variant bits that are totally accurate in themselves, but a process of synthesis, of seeing underlying patterns, which can express in the chart in many different ways." Now for my conversation with Mo. Thanks again, Mo, for doing this project with me and for helping me make this series a reality. Appreciate you. Please be sure to check out the links to Mo's website and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. All right, Mo, thank you so much for being with me today and for doing this research with me and doing this episode with me where we kind of sum everything up and discuss our findings and hopefully set the record straight. I don't think we're gonna do that today. There's always going to be more, but yeah, how's it going?
I mean, it's going. But yeah, I'm so glad that I found someone who's also, I mean, I'm assuming you're as big of a Rob Hand stan as I am. So whenever Rob Hand, he tends to do this thing where he drops these seemingly small or offhand comments, but then you actually go and look into it, and there's actually so much there you can pull out of it. And that's the thing I love about engaging with his material. So thank you for also being as invested in it and giving me the chance to hop on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course I knew about Rob Hand, but I think being a relatively new student, I haven't engaged with a ton of his work. But I was just really excited to like do some research into this comment that he made, because I thought it was just really interesting and really ripe for inquiry and just like doing research and kind of trying to get to the bottom of it, or find nuance within the statement or what have you. So yeah, it's been a really interesting process to go through this. Yeah, so why don't we start by explaining, I guess we can reiterate what Rob Hand said, and then we can kind of explain how we interpreted that and what we did in reference to the research that we carried out. Do you want to go ahead and kind of summarize what he said?
Sure. So, for those of you who did not have the chance to watch that series of episodes that Chris Brennan did on the Astrology Podcast, where he recruited some veterans from Project Hindsight to talk about developments in astrology and their process getting involved in Project Hindsight and just what they learned from going through different iterations of the astrological tradition, Robert Hand made this offhand comment about the relationship between the part of fortune, the place of acquisition or accomplishment, which is the 11th sign from the lot of fortune, and its association to Mercury. So he said, you either need to have Mercury holding the sign or holding the lot of fortune in some way, or being associated with the place of acquisition or accomplishment. And that really sparked this idea amongst a lot of astrologers. I mean, he made kind of what seemed like a semi-joke that really good astrologers tend to have these sorts of configurations, or it was something that he even observed during a particular, I guess, meeting of Project Hindsight. And it just inspired SP and I to go on this journey and really see if Mercury is really that important. And for those of you who don't know, Mercury is one of the planets that traditionally gets associated with astrologers or people who interface with the divine in some way. So, yeah.
Yeah, not only is it like astrologers, but it's the planet associated with astrology, like as a field. I think also it's important to differentiate the fact that Rob Hand differentiated between Mercury and a professional astrologer versus just Mercury and a regular astrologer.
Right.
He talks about Mercury ruling the lot of fortune, either ruling the lot of fortune or the place of acquisition, or being in one of those places, being co-present with the lot of fortune or being in the place of acquisition, as like making money from astrology. But he just says like all you need to be an astrologer is to have a Mercury. So yeah, okay, thank you for summarizing that. So yeah, do you want to kind of explain what we did in terms of the research, like how many charts we looked at, the different kinds of charts we looked at, like the rating criteria that we had, and then like kind of the rulership scheme, the different levels of rulership that we looked at?
Right. So this is where the fun comes in, right? I know that a lot of us are used to thinking about the zodiac in terms of the 12 signs, but for those of you who are really into a lot of the older forms of astrology, we look more at these subdivisions of the zodiac beyond the 12 typical divisions we're used to, because you can always find an association or a rulership that a planet has of a particular slice, right? So what we wanted to do was we not only considered the sign that the actual lot of fortune was in, as well as the sign of the place of acquisition, right? In terms of where the lot of fortune sits, you can get a lot of symbolism about what that lot means for you based on the term lord. So for those of you who don't know what term lords are, they're these uneven divisions of every sign which belong to one of the 5 planets. The luminaries do not get them. Okay, so there's no sun term of anything. Okay, just, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Only planets that get terms. But anyway, the idea is that it's like being an owner of a room in a house or being a mayor of a city within a country. You get to make your own laws within that territory, as long as they're following whatever the agenda of the sign and the ruling planet is. So you get to do, say you have something in Mars's term in Gemini, you get to do martial things in a Gemini and Mercurial way. But you get to do what Mars wants to do. And this is important because it's kind of bringing flavor to what the lot of fortune represents in your chart. We also included the decans as well, which are also called faces. And these are these 10-degree divisions of the zodiac, right? There's a lot of rich symbolism that gets associated with decans, and there are certain qualities of the planets that get associated with them that can also show up. Decans are more like skill sets that are innate to a particular planet or point, in this case, the Lot of Fortune, that is in your chart. And so there's something symbolic that the decan and its lord is doing. So we considered both Chaldean as well as triplicity decan rulerships because, me being a student of Austin Kovic, and having applied this in practice for a couple of years, I've seen both work out. I can't refute both, so I considered, whether Mercury was decanic lord in one system or the other system, because both systems do work. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive in my view. So we included those as well. And then finally, obviously, as Rob Hand stated, you needed Mercury in association. So if Mercury is sharing the sign, even better if they're conjunct. Mercury is sort of bringing that influence directly into the Lot of Fortune just because they're sharing space together, right? And then the same would apply if Mercury was in the place of accomplishment because it's bringing that mercurial influence to the place. So in the context of the place of accomplishment, you would only consider the sign because the place of accomplishment involves the whole sign, right?
Right.
It's a whole sign thing. So as for
and
charts,
just to be clear with everybody, I just want to say we looked at, I don't know about you, Mo, but like I mostly just use whole sign, the whole sign house system.
Yeah.
So we looked at charts in the whole sign house system. If that's not for you, I'm sorry. That's kind of how I've been learning how to look at charts. It's the house system I use. No shade to anybody else, but that's just what we did. So yeah, that's just important to know.
Right. And, when considering the place of accomplishment, that is a whole sign technique. It's not a quadrant technique, by the way. So you can use, as we learned from the revival of this house debate, what was really done and what we should probably be moving towards is sort of this integration of quadrant as well as whole sign house systems. And whole sign systems are valid and there are certain things that they can tell you. I say this as someone who's also studying Vedic. So, if you really want to learn, go study a new system of astrology you're not as familiar with. There are a lot of principles that could apply bidirectionally, which is cool. But yes, this is very much a whole sign thing that we did. I'm sure that people who may be more familiar with how to apply this correctly in a quadrant context could tell us more.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And honestly, if you're listening to this and that's you, reach out to me because I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yes. Like this series is so good. I've only gotten through maybe the episode with Amy, but I'm like just listening like back and forth about like you interviewing these different astrologers in terms of what does it mean to be an astrologer and what are these signatures that come with being an astrologer. And I think it's a really cool series. And I'm hoping that what you guys get from everybody else who's been on SP's podcast thus far, and hopefully this episode as well, is that there's so many things that go into making an astrologer. And that's what we're hoping to share with you today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I just want to say thank you to everybody that participated. I feel so lucky that I get to have these conversations with people. I feel like I'm just like an astrology student with a microphone and people want to talk to me for some reason. And I just feel grateful. So yeah, thanks everybody. And thank you, Mo, for being a part of it. Do you want to get into, a little bit more about the number of like the sample size we had, some of that information?
Okay. So for those of you people who are very statistics obsessed, I hate to break it to you. We only went with about, I want to say we had 93 charts or something to that effect of the 227 astrologer charts that were available on AstroSeek in their database. And these charts that we used were of a chart rating of B or higher. So if it's a B rating in Astro Databank, it means that it was coming from some kind of biography, right? A rating from memory, or the person themselves having, recollection of their birth time told you. And then obviously double A, which is the gold standard. You get someone's actual birth certificate and
Right.
it's documented there. So,
and just to clarify, we used a mixture of charts from AstroSeek, the database that I've provided in the show notes, and then as well as just Astro Databank, different famous astrologers from there. Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap between like the charts that are there. I believe that most of the charts are in both databases, but there were some that were in one database and others that were not in the other database. So, but the rating scale that we're using, it applies to both databases. And so we use charts that we have a pretty high confidence in terms of their accuracy. So yeah. We also did do a survey of astrologers who are using Twitter, for example, and they did share some useful information about their charts. And we tried to make it as, okay, you don't have to give us your entire birth chart, but just give us these things, because that's all we need to do a quick survey of some of these principles.
Yeah, and so we ended up there are a ton of people that participated. We ended up kind of cleaning up the data a little bit and using about 45 data from about 45 participants. We confirmed that they were a professional astrologer and then asked them questions about some of the same information, but we did not look at their charts. So they self-disclosed this information. And so we're kind of looking at our findings a little bit differently. We kind of separate them out a little bit, but they're similar findings, I'll say. So it's not really that much different.
Yeah. Okay, so we can start with what we found of, our lot of fortune data. I think we could start with our self-reported examples. I think that could be helpful.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do it.
Let's see. So of our 46 charts that we did end up using, because these people were confirmed to be earning money through astrology and the practice of astrology in some way, whether they're scholars in teaching or, consulting, right? We actually found that 80% of the participants, so 37 out of 46 people, did meet this criteria on some level, with only 9 out of the 46 not meeting these criteria, which was interesting. I was surprised.
Yeah.
I was expecting way less. So
yeah, same.
Yeah.
One thing I additionally want to say is and I'm interested to hear your take on this, Mo, as an academic. I'm kind of a former academic. So I have some knowledge of statistics and what goes into a valid statistical study. Yeah. And I know it's a very fraught thing in astrology to even take that as a starting point. I don't think what we're doing here is trying to give statistical validation to what makes an astrologer, but we are just kind of looking at examples and we're looking at averages, which I think is a very common thing in astrology, looking at charts, seeing what trends kind of show up over and over again, rather than trying to find a statistical significance. It's different. Yeah. It's a different thing mathematically. We're not doing any kind of statistics. And I just want to be clear about that because I think it's an important distinction to make.
Right. And, someone who's coming from life sciences, medical science type stuff, what's funny is that while we were doing this, I think I was in the middle of brushing up on statistical considerations for clinical trial study designs, right? And I think there was this parameter that you can do for how you rate an outcome, because, sometimes when you're making survival curves to study the efficacy of a drug, you're okay, time to an event, but you can have multiple, different ways of getting to a particular event. So say you want to give someone, I don't know, medication for ALS, for example, right? And some of the end stage disease type things are needing to have a tracheostomy. So you need to have an alternate breathing method because your muscles are not working effectively for you to breathe normally on your own. So that, and death and one other criteria being sort of end stage disease outcomes. And it's like, okay, they're not exactly the same thing, but clinically they represent like a particular outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know one criticism of trying to do stats is, oh, what are your criteria for having an outcome? And I think that this sort of study, just because so much of astrology is qualitative,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to have a good sense of what these interpretive nuances mean so that you
Right.
can know when you're having an event versus not having an event. And I think that because our criteria were very clear, and like you said, SP, we're not necessarily trying to do that statistical perfection, because in my view, like, if you know enough stats, you can fudge anything.
Right.
Let me tell you. So statistics are not the end all be all, but it does help to see these sorts of proportions
Right.
within the samples that we do have. And it's interesting how consistent it is. So
Awesome. Yeah. So let's talk about our famous astrologer charts, and we can kind of break down what we found there.
So with the lot of fortune, we had, so of our 91 chart examples that we did end up using, I mean, there were in Astro Seek, there were 227. I think there were more in Astro Databank.
Yeah, there are a ton in Astro Databank.
We just took the ones that are of some familiarity, right? Or had, really good biographical data as well, just to see if there was some interpretive nuance we could also see through their placements. But we found that 63 out of 91 of these people met the criteria, meaning that 71% were meeting this criteria on some level, whereas, about 29% were not. And so you can see that a majority of this sample of astrologers that we do have data for, as well as just a random sample of, people we found on Twitter, right? You can see that more people who self-identify as astrologers, or people who are identified as astrologers, have these sorts of configurations of the lot of fortune, which is huge. But I know a lot of people, when they first heard this on Twitter and saw this going on the rounds, they were like, oh, I'm kind of disappointed that I'm not identified as astrologer in this way. But then you had other people feeling like a sense of relief that, okay, now it's not something that I have to do. And I think that we must reiterate that this is not the only way to become an astrologer, right?
Right. Yeah, and one thing I want to say about the survey data that might be operative, like before I forget, this is kind of like maybe a limitation of the study. But before I forget, I just want to mention that maybe people were more likely to do our survey if they met the criteria.
Yeah.
And they kind of were more willing to self-disclose that information. But I mean, a certain percentage didn't meet the criteria and they still disclosed. So I don't know how much of an effect that kind of had, the kind of confirmation bias, if that's the word for it.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But I do find some solace in the fact that the result that we found when we looked at people's charts, looked at famous astrologers' charts, is quite similar to the number of people that meet the criteria, or the percentage of people that meet the criteria in our survey data.
Right. It's kind of wild, actually. And so that gives me some indication that yes, on some level, Rob Hand was correct in his observation, but remember, it's not the end all be all, which takes us to our next point. So of the major hermetic lots, it's not just the lot of fortune, it's the lot of spirit. And I know that you just had Dr. Alomi on your podcast to talk about this, right? And I didn't get the chance to listen to that yet, but do you want to reiterate some of his key points?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that episode, Dr. Alomi, Ali basically confirms what Rob Hand says, that the lot of fortune being ruled by Mercury on some level, whether that be sign, term, iconic rulership. Ali goes even as far as to look at the Dodecatemoria, which is the 12th part. On some level, Mercury has some rulership. He also confirmed that Mercury co-present a lot, or conjunct a lot, makes Mercury the co-ruler of that lot. And that goes for any planet and any lot. If any planet is conjunct a lot, they become the co-ruler of that lot. So he basically confirmed what Rob Hand said in relation to the lot of fortune, as well as the place of acquisition being Mercury ruled or having Mercury there. But in addition, he adds that what he calls a lot of the hidden in the medieval Islamic tradition, it's called a lot of the hidden. We kind of know it more commonly in contemporary astrology is the lot of spirit, which is the lot of the sun, which you can kind of talk to us more about in a moment, Mo. He says that if that lot has the rulership of Mercury or is co-present Mercury is involved in some way, that can also indicate astrology as well. And he gives a lot of different criteria as well. He talks about Mercury in a certain sign, Mercury's placement. We're not going to get into that here. Definitely go back and listen to that episode if you are interested in the different addenda he adds to what makes an astrologer. But he basically confirms what Rob Hand says, but also adds in a lot of spirit.
Yeah, I think that that's a very beautiful observation that Mercury, you can have Mercury in so many other configurations, and that's still getting you to being an astrologer or diviner or someone who has this higher wisdom and access to the calculations necessary to understand the stars and what they're trying to tell us is one that, people who are aspiring to be astrologers should take solace in. And I really love that the lot of the hidden, or as we know, the lot of spirit, is something that's brought up a lot because I really think about the distinction between spirit and fortune. So I think that this comes down to an important fundamental dichotomy that exists within, I guess, the Hellenistic sphere. But I think that it's also just the struggle of people who are really into spirituality or even just understanding how the world works. There's always this struggle between the tangible experiences that we have, which can describe our embodiment, which is very much fortune. What are the material circumstances that are, supporting or not supporting a particular outcome? Whereas spirit describes this sort of conscious, abstract experience that we're having while we're trying to live in this very material world, right? I really loved watching, I believe it was one of Sam Reynolds' talks at 2020 NORWAC, where he was talking about the lots and playing your part, right? And he talks a lot about the lot of spirit being what you worship in life. It's the thing that you devote to. It's that thing you want to put a lot of effort, conscious effort into. It's the lot of the sun for a reason. And a lot of people think of the sun as the ego. It's like, no, the sun is like that divine spark that motivates existence, right? It motivates us to do things. It's the thing we're trying to become, right? And so I think it's interesting because what I was talking about with SP before we actually hopped on was that I feel like on one level, maybe spirit describes sort of the conscious choice of engaging with astrology in that way. Whereas fortune, if you have a lot of that influence, it seems like circumstance is almost pushing you or bringing those circumstances to bring astrology into your life. And so we wanted to look at, the lot of spirit or the lot of the hidden and see if people who even didn't meet the criteria also had mercurial influences there. And I think what we did here was we broke the charts down into the people who met the criteria versus the people who didn't. And we looked at similar conditions for the lot of spirit. So first we looked at what sign was it in, right? We looked at the term Lord. We looked at the decanic Lord in the triplicity system as well as the Chaldean system. Another thing that I also did was I considered where the Lord of the lot was, because that was, I don't think we included that here, but that's something I did note, and you can look at it later. But our main criteria were the sign, is Mercury co-present? Does Mercury own the decan? Does Mercury own the terms? And so what we actually found was really interesting. So 66 people met our criteria, right?
Or sorry,
65. I'm just saying that's 66. So 65 people met the criteria, right? And so only 29 out of those 65 who met the criteria actually also had the lot of spirit be mercurial in some way. And so that means only about 47% of those people had like that spirit association with Mercury. Whereas 33 of our 60, oh, it's actually 62. I'm like crazy. Okay. 62.
Yeah, that's my fault.
It's okay.
Yeah.
33 of our 62 didn't have that spirit activation. So about 53%. And so this is looking more like of the people who had that strong, where it seems like circumstances promoting astrology as being relevant for their lives, only half of them, for only about a little less than half of them, it's like a thing that they are consciously choosing. Whereas for the other half, or like the slight majority, perhaps there are other things in their life that are more, that are driving them more, even if astrology is something that they are engaging with, right?
Right.
Just quickly, I'm thinking of two examples that I'm actually looking at on our chart. So PVRN Rao and KN Rao. So they're two astrologers who are of the Vedic tradition who are coming from the same lineage. And I think of the fact that they both come from a similar family of astrologers. And I think of that fortune connection where circumstance has embedded astrology into the framework of both of their lives. Whereas, you know, for some of these other people, it's like, yes, astrology is a part of the framework of my life, but it's something I'm actively choosing. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. Yeah. And then moving on, for the folks who didn't meet the lot of fortune criteria, what did we find in relation to looking at their lot of spirit?
So we had 26 people who didn't meet the criteria for either on this list. And what we found was that 14 out of the 26, so about 54%, actually did have some sort of spirit activation involving Mercury. And then 12 out of 26, so the other 46%, did not have a spirit activation involving Mercury. So it's looking about half and half, with a slight majority of these people having astrology as something that they're actively choosing, and it's a part of maybe their sort of lifeblood, right? Whereas, you know, again, a lot of spirit is focusing on other things for these people. And so for the 12 where that wasn't manifesting, you could clearly see that there's something else perhaps there's something else in their chart that's speaking to astrology, and it's not necessarily related to the sort of circumstances of their life, or, you know, the things they worship in life. There could be other things that they care more about, right? I mean, they're still doing astrology. They're on this list. So, and then, you know, when we factor in both fortune and spirit, this puts our grand total at 79 out of 91 people having fortune, spirit, or both influencing astrology, influenced by Mercury, and being astrologers, whereas there were only 12 out of our 91 chart examples that did not have this going on. So that's interesting to think about. Like, it's crazy how, like, when you throw in the lot of spirit, it adds a few more people, but there's still a sizable amount of people for whom this is not true. And they're still engaging with astrology, which is cool.
Yeah. So just to summarize really quickly, when we look at just the lot of fortune, we have 63 of 91 people that meet the criteria. That's about 71.5%. And then we have 26 out of 91 who don't meet the criteria, and that's about 28.5%. Then when we throw in the lot of spirit, again, we have 79 people who have either the lot of fortune and or the lot of spirit out of 91, and that comes to about 86.8% of our sample. And then again, there's this, as you said, small but significant minority of people who don't qualify for Rob Hand's lot of fortune, place of acquisition criteria. And Mercury is also not ruling their lot of spirit in any way that we looked at.
And guess what? They are still astrologers or engaging with astrology in a very significant way. And some of the names that come up may surprise you. actually, of people who didn't meet any of these criteria.
Yeah, so I'll just say that the names of people who didn't meet the criteria: Andre Barbeau, Charles Emerson, Susan Townley, David and John Frowley, Liz Green, Alan Leo, Joan Quigley. So some quite big names, some very influential and important astrologers of the last century don't meet this criteria at all, as far as we looked at it. And still astrologers make money from astrology. So yeah, like to kind of summarize, we wanted to look at a few examples from these charts, or we wanted to look at a few examples from this list of people who didn't meet either criteria, and just see what's going on in their charts that might be another indication of astrology somehow.
Yeah.
So where do you want to go from here?
Let's start with Joan Quigley. I mean,
Okay.
I just find it really fascinating because she was quite the talk of the town, because she was Nancy Reagan and by extension Ronald Reagan's astrologer. And this was a very big deal because she was using astrology to help Ronald Reagan do certain things politically. So this is why she is a notable figure. What's really interesting about her chart is that if you look at her ascendant, Virgo,
Right.
Virgo rising,
right,
and you do see the ruler of the ninth being that really happy Venus and Taurus in the ninth, right?
Yeah, and then interestingly, we have Virgo rising. We have the MC Gemini, but we have this kind of fallen Mercury on an angle, very close to the angle at 22 Pisces, but in the 7th house of Pisces, in the sign of its fall, where it ostensibly maybe shouldn't be able to operate as well, but I don't know how much that's operative here.
Right. I mean, but if you also look at it, you see that Mercury is enclosed between the ruler of the ninth, that Venus, and then it's near Jupiter, and it's answering to that Jupiter, who's pretty happy where it is. So,
right.
I mean, it's really supporting this role that astrology is playing, and I can see how this might speak to her ability to influence law and politics. I mean, sextile to the ninth house.
Right.
So,
and then additionally, talking about lot of fortune as like how your life is being propelled, she has that lot of fortune in the 9th house of law, religion, travel, all those 9th house associations. So,
and then it's the lot has that Venus ruling it, right? And so, didn't Amy tell you something about Venus in the 9th being really important for?
I'd have to go back to the conversation because it's such a great quote, and I'm not going to get the quote right, but definitely go back and listen to Amy's episode. But she says, talking about Firmicus's delineations of Venus in the 9th, being as if proclaiming of the gods, something like that, like kind of speaking for the gods. And so there is this very fitting element of, the ruler of the 9th in the 9th being Venus in particular as like a signification of astrology.
Yeah, for sure. Which is wild. So there you go. Again, like watch that 9th house. The next example I want to go to maybe is John Frowley.
Awesome. One other thing I want to mention in reference to Joan Quigley is that, and I feel like this is a bit of a lesser indication, but what's conjunct the midheaven? Mars ruling the 3rd. So some of those 3rd house significations may as well be brought into the work that she's doing in the world through the midheaven.
Yes. No, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I feel like a lot of people sleep on the relationship that the 3rd house also has with divination as well. Like that can't be ignored. So
right, absolutely. And I think Cameron really spoke to that in his episode, which I really enjoyed his contributions and thoughts about the 3rd house. I thought it was really, because it is not something that people emphasize the 9th house, I think, in relation or in comparison to the 3rd house. So it's definitely cool to hear that.
Yeah. So we can go to John Frawley next. I mean, his chart really baffles me because there's, like, if we go with stereotypical everything, there's like nothing really standing out to me. I mean, yes, my whole signs, ninth house is Virgo. That Mercury is really happy in Gemini.
Yeah. Mercury and Gemini, yeah.
Near, wait a second. I believe that Mercury, oh wait, no, almost. So Moon and Jupiter have mutual reception,
Right.
but everything else in the chart answers to that Mercury. Everything else.
Right on.
Damn it. The moon Jupiter really ruined it.
Yeah, but I do also want to speak to the quote that I put forward from Christopher Warnock, where he was talking about him and Chris both having angular Aquarius moons. He was talking in particular about Aquarius moon and intuition, but just saying that on a trip that he took to Japan, that he looked at a lot of the charts of like quote unquote fortune tellers because it's more kind of socially acceptable there. And he was surprised to see how many angular moons or dignified moons he saw. And while the moon in the sign of Pisces, it's not quite like a place of exaltation or a domicile place for the moon, but the moon here is in the third house, the house of its joy. So all those associations of the third house come in that I guess we didn't mention, but kind of like ritual, local kind of spirits, local religious practice, rather than kind of like the ninth house pilgrimage religious practice that can kind of come up. And in addition, Jupiter is quite angular in the seventh house and in mutual reception with the moon, and Jupiter is exalted. So yeah, very strong moon, I would say.
Another thing that Frawley does have going for him, and this isn't a criteria that we used, but his lot of fortune is in Aries and the ruler is Mars. And that Mars is in Gemini. So like,
right.
Again, the ruler of the lot is being influenced by Mercury. And even though it's like more of a distal thing, I think like for the fact that Mars also rules his midheaven as well, which is where his chart ruler is sitting, I think that it makes sense that doing astrology in a very technical way, using the symbols to like predict events for specific questions is kind of what he's really known for. And I also think of the fact that his horary book is one that a lot of people who do study horary end up using. And so I think that, that's like a weird, fun thing that does come up for his chart. So
yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it gets back to this idea that like where a planet is placed in the chart, it kind of it can't just work with whatever it wants. It has to work with the resources that the sign gives it and the ruler of the sign, as well as the house. So like all the martial things are filtered through this Mars and Gemini placement that Frawley has. And so that definitely impacts a lot of fortune in Aries, and maybe even more importantly, the MC in Scorpio. I'm just taking a look real quick at, okay, so it's right off of Mercury's term rulership in Scorpio ends at 19. So it's in the term of Jupiter.
Which is comical. But his chart ruler is in the terms of Mercury. So, I mean, the interest is there. It's there.
Yeah.
It might not be the most obvious thing, but it's there, right?
Yeah. And for those of you listening, John Frawley is 14-degree Capricorn ascendant with Saturn at 17 degrees in the terms of Mercury, basically on the midheaven.
Scorpio. Yeah. Is Alan Leo our next chart, or was it?
Yeah, let's take a look at Alan Leo's chart.
So Alan Leo, the person I have a lot of beef with, he's the father of modern astrology and obviously, theosophy and all the weird occult things that got really popular, right? That was all him. I mean, if you read his bio, what's hilarious is that he's actually a businessman. Yeah. it's pretty funny. But
It's almost like Mercury is on his ascendant or something.
yeah, Mercury and Joy. What
But
a
also like a
concept.
million other planets. Yeah, Mercury and Joy. That's a good point. But yeah,
Domiciled Sun, final
mhm,
dispositor of the chart.
right. So Alan Leo has Leo rising with Jupiter, the Sun, Mercury,
And
and
Saturn.
Saturn in Leo.
Mm-hmm. This one really floored me. I was like, I would expect this guy to have, Mercury on all the lots and everything. Nope,
Mm-hmm.
Mercury is not influencing any of the lots, the place of the like none of it. What is interesting about his chart, though, is that his lot of fortune falls in the ninth house in Aries,
Mm,
and it's actually with the moon.
right.
And I feel like this is something we'll need to explore in another episode because you know what? This was actually making me think of a blog post I wrote a while ago about Mercury, the moon, and the mind, and how there's so much syncretism and overlap between the significations of the moon and Mercury.
Right.
And I feel like, as you were saying with that example you brought up from Christopher Warnock talking about the angularity of the moon or just having the moon prominent in some way, maybe even associating with some of these points, there's probably a case for the moon being
Mm-hmm.
significant. And so the moon is with a lot of fortune and they're both in the ninth house. I mean, that already tells you enough, right?
Right. Yeah, it definitely adds a lot of interesting information
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Yeah. And then Mercury is again in the first house, rejoicing. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And interestingly, again, just like the last chart we looked at, Mercury's term rulership in Leo ends at 24.
mm-hmm.
So the ascendant's in the term of Mars. And
Yeah.
then just looking at Taurus, what's the degree of the midheaven in Taurus?
It's like, is it 15 or 16?
That's so funny because Mercury's term rulership in Taurus ends at 14. So it's right out of the term rulership of
I mean,
Mercury.
it's in one of the decans of Mercury, though. That midheaven is in the
Mm-hmm.
triplicity system. The
Yeah.
middle decan is Mercury.
Yeah. So the middle decan of the Chaldean decan is the moon, and the middle decan
Is Mercury.
in the traditional decan is Mercury. So yeah, those kind of mercurial skills get tied in with the midheaven.
Yeah, it's just giving a cult.
Mm,
It's giving a cult.
yeah, I mean, especially too with like Venus in the 12th ruling the midheaven, uh, relatively dignified in
Oh,
Cancer.
and Venus is also in Mercury's decan. What a concept.
Mm, yeah,
I love it. Is it in Mercury's term, the Venus?
let's take a look. It's at 1821
I feel like it
Cancer.
is.
So yeah, Venus is in Mercury's term because Mercury's term ends at 19. So yeah, a very mercurial Venus in Cancer,
It's there. It's subtle. It's
right?
there. Yeah. So I mean, it really speaks to, in spite of him being a businessman, which is like his day job, like, it really speaks to that sort of theosophy. And then I think of that Venus being in the 12 and him importing a lot of ideas from different cultures, especially Eastern cultures, into, some of his spiritual ideas. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. All right, so let's move on to look at our last example. We're going to look at Liz Green's chart.
hmm This one was so surprising because I know Liz Green has written a few books about astrology, which is interesting as well because one of the books that I actually do own by her is this one she wrote about Saturn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
own the same one. That's like the book I've read by Liz Green.
yeah, I mean it's as much as I don't like the natural house thing and how
Mm-hmm.
she uses it. It was still really helpful for like understanding Saturn as a concept, and I thought it was a
Yeah,
really good book.
yeah. To be
Um,
honest, I kind of like once she gets to that part, I like can't really read it because I can't. She does associate each of the houses with a sign,
mhm.
and it's just like it's confusing to me because I haven't really learned that system.
Mm.
But the introduction where she kind of like just generally talks about Saturn is super super interesting.
Yeah, it's helpful, and I find that that book and maybe some other ones she's written have been helpful to other astrologers as well, especially coming from that psychological framework.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, she's a late Scorpio rising,
Yeah,
right?
she's 28 Scorpio rising. So she is in her ascendant's in the bounds of Saturn.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Venus moon decan.
she has a kind of Libra stellium in the 12th with Venus, Jupiter, Mars, and then we got Chiron and Neptune as well. And then her 10th house, or I'm sorry, her 11th house, she has a Virgo midheaven. So again, Mercury showing up. Very interestingly, she has the Sun and Mercury in Virgo, with Mercury at 1 Virgo in its own term, its own triplicity decan.
Yeah.
Not sure which Chaldean decan it is, but
the Sun.
The Sun, yeah. So we have this like super dignified Mercury showing up, and it's very much speaks to her career as an astrological writer, I think.
Yeah. I can see that. Definitely agree. It just like makes so much sense with her chart, especially. I don't think Mars is in Mercury's term. I don't think so. It might be a little too late.
Yeah, let me look. Mars is at 16 Libra. Mercury's term ends at 14.
Okay, so it's a little off. Okay.
Yeah. And then the midheaven is in Venus's term as well. So that's not super operative.
No, but I mean, yeah, but you know what is funny? So the moon does rule the ninth, and it is in her second house. And another thing that she's earned a living from writing astrology books, but for all the water signs, the moon is the final triplicity lord. And so her first, fifth, and ninth houses all have the moon as that last triplicity lord. And the last triplicity lord of the ninth speaks to sciences and the occults and astrology. And so her earning a living through astrology shows up in that way, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point.
You can't, focus on just this one thing and like freak out that, oh, like Mercury's not doing a lot because this, that, and the third. And also I need to remind people that Mercury rules things beyond astrology. So I've been in the Vedic system a lot, but even in some of the older Western texts, Mercury rules the marketplace. It rules trade. It rules coinage.
Right.
There are lots of people who do economic stuff, and that's Mercury.
Right.
Mercury rules, scribes, writers. Hello, not just astrology. So don't freak out.
Right.
Don't freak out.
Yeah. So I think to conclude, while many of the charts we looked at, both famous astrologers and people who kind of contributed to our survey were contemporary professional astrologers, while a majority of those, over 80% approximately, while they met the criteria, either the lot of fortune and or the lot of spirit, not all of them did. And some of those people were very successful professional astrologers anyway. And astrology, as we've talked about, and as I've talked about on this series with other guests, it shows up in a number of different ways. So again, I think the takeaway is that it's a little bit more nuanced. While what Rob Hand said was important and is true, it's not the end all be all. There are quite a bit of nuances. So at this time, to before we wrap up, I just want to talk about some of the limitations of our study, maybe what we could have improved, things we might look at in the future, or other things we could have looked at. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, for one, I think that, for example, I know while the lots are important, there are a lot of people who do not really use the lots in their astrology, right? And, some people could argue that looking at the ascendant, the chart ruler, the midheaven would probably tell you a lot more. And you know what? That's probably true. Another thing is, with, at least in the case of John Frawley, considering where the ruler of the lot is also really important. And that's something we probably could have done. But at the same time, I'm like, there's so many criteria.
Right. Yeah. At some point, we have to just say enough is enough,
Yeah, we have to cut it off at some point.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And,
but I think that is really important, though. I think, did you say John Frawley?
Yeah, for John Frawley.
there are a
the
few
ruler of his
people.
fortune. There were a few
Yeah.
people, yeah, who had that as well, where it's like, oh, nothing is happening. But if you look at the ruler of fortune or the ruler of the place of accomplishment or like the ruler's spirit, it's in Gemini or Virgo somewhere. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that another thing that was really hard is that, as I kind of spoke about with Dorje on our episode,
mhm,
it's kind of hard to say exactly what a professional astrologer is. Like, what's the cutoff for that? It's like, if you made $5 doing a reading, are you now a professional astrologer? Some would say yes. If you have had a 20-year career, does that, like, is there some kind of like time criteria that we want to look
mhm,
at? Is there
yeah,
some kind of, it's just, do you make most of your money from astrology? There are
right,
just a lot of challenges. And the fact of the matter is like, we had a little bit of biographical information about people, but we don't really know the details about people's finances or like
right,
how much money they're bringing in with astrology. It's kind of hard to have any of that information anyway. And on top of it, like, I'm just not an astrological historian, so I don't necessarily know some of these figures in depth. And I think that that's definitely makes it a little
mhm,
bit harder. We're talking about the qualitative nature of astrology, and a lot of what I've seen astrologers do looking at birth charts is like, you have to know biographical information. And
mhm.
so, I don't necessarily have that in-depth knowledge of these people's lives of the different charts that we looked at.
That's another good point. I mean, another thing as well, just even for our survey examples, like, I don't know what these people do outside of astrology, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Mercury, like I said, Mercury has a lot of other significations, and Mercury could be ruling other things. I mean, I'll use myself as an example. I meet a few of these criteria.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I'm an astrologer, but I'm a science person. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's me, a lot of the time. And so I think that, like you were saying, it's important to realize we only have so much biographical information, even for the people we do have biographies for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there are other parts of their lives that aren't documented. And I also think of some historical astrologers, especially from the Islamic traditions or even from the Renaissance period, where, biographies have often been sanitized to remove certain parts of
Mm-hmm.
their history that are not
Yeah.
desirable,
It's
right?
interesting that you say that. Like, Tycho Brahe was one of the people that was on
Mm-hmm.
this famous astrologist chart. And I was listening to a BBC podcast recently because I was familiar with the name. And like 30 minutes in, they get into like, oh, yeah, this guy did astrology. But they introduced him originally as an astronomer, which is
Yeah.
true. But, throughout history, sometimes astrology and astronomy were one and the same, or one kind of informed the other,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
that is really on point too. Sometimes it could be hard, even within history, to discern the truth
Mm-hmm.
about people's lives.
Right. No, I'm in agreement there. And then other limitations of this particular study.
I mean, we could have done more charts, but like, we're just two people with lives, and I think we
Yeah.
did. I think we did a pretty good job, given, looking at about 100 charts is not easy.
No.
Um, we could definitely increase the sample size. There are also additional things that we could look at that I would love to do more and look at that. So
Mm-hmm.
we could be really more systematic about looking at the term rulers of the ascendant and the midheaven.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can also, as Ali suggested, we could look at the 12th part of the ascendant
Mm-hmm.
to see if that is Mercury ruled. We could look at the 12th part of the lots to see if those are Mercury ruled. We didn't get down to that level of kind of nitty gritty detail.
Yeah.
So that's something that we could do. We could also look and see what's going on with the moon in
Yeah.
charts. In addition, Ali spoke to the 11th place from the lot of spirit and what
Mm.
kind of aspects are being made to that place.
Mm.
So there are, and I just want to shout out Ali as well. Ali just recently, right around when I released his episode on his Patreon, he put out a whole translation about what makes an astrologer, which has basically, the majority of that information that we cover there, we didn't cover in the episode and we don't cover in the series. So there's just so much that can go into this. There's so many different things that you can look at. And I don't know, maybe we'll do another episode where we look at some of those different things that could be cool. Yeah, not too sure, but we'll see what happens with that.
I mean, the one strength of this is that I think this provides a great framework if you want to study people in a particular industry. Like, I want to study athletes, I want to study models, I want to study scientists. Like, you could literally adopt this framework, which houses are associated with that, which planets are associated with that, how do the lots play in? And I think that that's what I really love about this particular framework. And I think the thing that I take from Rob Hand's offhand comment, specifically referencing the place of acquisition and the lot of fortune, is it kind of can say things about how people earn their livelihood and how much livelihood they'll earn, right? Because, the 11th house, regardless, I don't care what astrological system you're talking about, Western, Vedic, modern, tradition, the 11th house is a house of gains and wish fulfillment. What do a lot of people want in this life? To have lots of shit. So I think that, this provides a framework for really thinking about how people can earn things and just like their ability to make certain things that they want for themselves come true. And so I think that this methodology or just that framework, it's like something that can apply to different fields. So it's like, okay, do you want to be a billionaire? Cool. Do you want to be president of the world? Fine. Like,
cool.
Here's a way for studying
look at
that.
like world leaders, see what's going on with their chart. Maybe look at this, and put that to the test and see if it, see if it's significant. And if it's not, that's interesting too,
Yeah.
I think that was the thing going into this, is like, I kind of wanted to prove Rob Hand wrong because I felt like it must be more complicated than he's making it be. But at the same time, like, I felt like I was pretty open. It was like, let's just find out what the information says and hopefully we can learn from that. And I feel like we've learned, I don't know, I've learned quite a bit from this whole experience. And so,
me too.
Yeah. With that, do you have any kind of closing thoughts? Anything you want listeners to kind of take away?
No, I feel like we really did a good job of covering this topic that was so embedded in the astro Twitter sphere for quite a bit. And this was a really fun exercise to do. And honestly, I can't wait to find other things to apply this to. Yeah, but thanks for having me, SP. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us where we can find you? Anything that you're working on right now? Any information you'd like to share?
Sure. Okay. So I am on every social media that you can think of, except maybe YouTube at this point, as Austral Tour. It's like the first part of Australia, and dash or underscore tour, like the first part of Taurus. Twitter, Instagram, I have a Substack. I've been writing a lot of great things. I want to write a lot more great things. I'm half of the Fixed Astrology Podcast. We are wrapping up our series on the planetary joys as well as just significations of houses, so that's fun. And I'm speaking at NORWAC the end of May.
Oh, awesome. So congrats.
Thanks.
What will you be speaking on?
Davison charts.
Cool. So relationship charts.
Yes, relationship charts and how to use them. So,
nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. And I'll be sure to link all that stuff in the show notes. And I just want to say again, Mo, thanks for being on. Thanks for doing this with me. It's been a fun adventure. And let me know the next time you want to do a research project. Yeah, I'm feeling like I want to do the moon because I feel like there's something there with the moon. Like, yeah, there's something. Yeah. I mean, this whole podcast is about my relationship and love for the moon. So I'm always down to do more. Yeah. So it would be fitting, super fitting if we did something about the moon, but everyone will have to stay tuned and see what if we come out with anything else. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Mo. I will talk to you soon. Okay. Enjoy, guys. To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.